It's really, really awesome being here with you. I know there are a whole bunch of old and new friends in this group. Really excited to be here with the larger 0xPark community. So we're going to have this panel for the next hour or so. I think the 5 people here all have kind of unique perspectives on the on-chain crypto native gaming, as it, world. And I think probably the most interesting way to run this panel is if we have it as a conversation. So feel free to relax, let loose. I think people here are all kind of like friends. So feel free to hop in, even kind of engage with each other outside of any kind of formal script. And we can. I know all of you are good about pushing the boundaries, so let's lean into that. And I thought maybe a question to start with is if we could just go around and you could share about yourself, your background, so people get to know you, what you're working on, and why you're working on it. Like, why did you gravitate towards this particular idea? And you can take a bit of time, like feel free to take like 3 to 5 minutes or so and just like really unpack it.
Cool, thanks. Hi, I'm Iain, also Sportsbeard on Discord and Twitter and things. And I work at a company called Playmint. And Playmint was formed about 6 months ago now with a team of games industry veterans, but with the goal of making what we were terming blockchain games. I guess we didn't really fully understand what blockchain games were 6 months ago, and we probably still don't now. But we've got our current best guess, which changes from month to month. But as is a good practice in games generally, we want to build small things quickly, get them out there, test them. Games generally are experimental, and I think that's amplified even more in the world of blockchain games, which is so new and growing as a space. We were thinking of making a dungeon game of some kind to start with, but around about the same time, an NFT called Loot was launched, which was just super interesting. It was pitched as just a composable game element. So it's an NFT, which is just 8 strings of text on a white text and a black background, and it's regular kind of RPG, dungeon, loot, armor, and weapons, and so on. The guy who released it, Dom Hoffman, said, there's no game design here, there's no art, that's for interpretation. So it was really was a composable game asset just open out there for the world to use, and it seemed to be, it was adopted by a lot of people in a lot of people's minds. And we felt like, well, if we're making a blockchain dungeon game, how can we do that without using loot? So that's kind of took us into the Lootverse, and we made a game called The Crypt. So it's a website game. The URL's thecrypt.game, and we have dungeons in the same style as loot. So 8 sets of traits in a dungeon, and players who own loot NFTs come to the website, connect your wallet, and choose one of our dungeons to raid. And it's on Ethereum mainnet. So we're designing within a limitation of you have to pay a decent amount of gas for every transaction fee. So it's a single transaction to raid, but we've built game around that. Outside of the transaction itself, there's a bit of depth in working out which dungeon your loot is going to be good against. And once you've worked out which dungeon your loot's going to be good against, you can go and find other players who also own loot who might be good against the same dungeon. So there's a level of collaboration and depth there before you go and raid. People can come to the website and raid. Once the dungeons are defeated, the best raiders get the best prizes, and the prizes are an NFT that we create. So it's blockchain gaming, but very NFT orientated, very much from the kind of, in many ways, it's when we're releasing many chapters, we're distributing. It's like an elaborate gamified mint of our relic NFTs, with a view that there's more to come in future. So we're a game studio. We've got big plans for big games, but we're releasing these experimental chapters of the crypt along the way.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Raf. I work for Dapper Labs. I've been making games for about 20 years now. And in 2017, I came to blockchain, not necessarily to make games, but more to try out entertainment and interactivity, because calling games are a complicated form. And my interest is not on a specific project. I'm more interested on how these new primitives allow for different kinds of gameplay, different kinds of games that have not been able to exist before. I think it's a foundational change, pretty much like internet changed a lot of the way we think about games, I think, and it's going to change in many layers on the way we play, the way we distribute games, the way we consume entertainment digitally. And I'm just curious on where this is going to go, and I've been thinking about this and trying experiments for the past 4 years. Yeah, I'm just very excited to be here and very happy that for the past year or so, like, there's this Cambrian explosion of ideas, and everybody started to do things, and I think it's not going to stop. So yeah, happy to be here.
And maybe before you pass it on, could you share a bit about like maybe a specific project you're working on right now in relation to this?
Right now, no, not right now, sorry. Right now, like, the main focus of Dapper at this point is a lot of collectibles, NFTs, but, it's a company thing.
Totally.
It makes a lot of sense, it's very popular. There is always this balance, right? You go very much to the edge, and there's nobody there, but then people come, and then there's this huge opportunity, right, in order to just grow horizontally, so that you get more people in, and it becomes more momentum. That's what basically the way I see what happened a lot in the past year or so. Lots of validation also of being there, and then it gets crowded, and like, oh, we're not the cool kids anymore, right? Like we got to go and take a step further and be where, like, the air is rarefied and keep experimenting. So right now, like, because of business, Dapper Labs more focused on the horizontal thing, but I think that experiments, some of the things like what Dark Forest does, like Embers, like I think those things are fantastic. What I'm very, very interested is about composability and the decentralization of the rule set, in the sense that games, historically, there is a person or a committee that defines exactly the structure of the rules. And with blockchain, those rules are not defined by one single entity. And the game itself, the development and the growth of the game can take a different path because another group started to deploy on top of the game that exists, if it's 100% native, right? And they take the game away, which for some games like EVE Online, and Humor's here, like did a fantastic game. When you think about that kind of dynamic applied to a game like EVE, which has like all this story and all these communities there, it just blows my mind what it could happen.
Awesome.
Hello, everyone. I'm Arthur. I'm one half of Moving Castles with GBN here. I have a background in...
Can you guys hear okay, by the way, in the back?
Is my...
Yeah.
Okay. Louder, like this. Full vocal range. Okay.
Sing.
Good. Beautiful. Hi, everyone. My name is Arthur. I'm one half of Moving Castles. We are a new game studio. We are interested in the design space where games are played between collective agents. So if this was a game, each table would be an agent in that game, controlled, governed, owned, and collectively created by the people sitting at it. And there would be different types of interactions between the tables themselves. And that's kind of the game space that we're interested in. We think this is interesting because we agree with the DF kind of thesis around games as the forefront of governance. And we also think that the kind of lines between gaming and what an organization is, or what, you know, the real economy is, kind of is blurring. And the way that we think that, you know, the way to interact with the economy might be through these entities themselves. And that's kind of the long-term vision that we're working towards, but we're very early in that vision, and we are currently doing a series of experiments around collective character creation, collective governance, different ways to use, like, shift between models of governance based on different game contexts, and kind of exploring that design space. And yeah, we're working on a more persistent proposal as a next step. Do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, everything was said about Moving Castle, but I'm GVN, the other half of Moving Castle, working on some of the game development we've done so far, and some art direction and world building. I have a background in cinema and game development, so I'm happy today to learn a lot about blockchain games specifically as well. So yeah.
Hi, my name is I work at DE.F.CON and on a project called Lattice. It all started about a year ago when I moved to Mexico to work on Dark Forest with the small team at a time, and I didn't really realize where it would lead me to. I think we were all pretty naive at that time, and we're still pretty naive. Something that is really interesting is that it feels like, just like blockchain is not necessarily about the technology, it's first and foremost, it's about culture and society. You know, you have those memes that pay you to stay alive, and they became very big. And now, I think that one thing I've always been interested in is the element of play and culture, and how a lot of our society is playful, yet it feels like our modes of play are actually kind of like regressing. There's less make-believe, there's less shared stories that are authorless and created by people. We're moving more and more towards experiences that are extremely, like, that are created by directors who want to decide essentially the whole script from A to Z. And I think that here there is an opportunity to get people to be playful on the internet and build culture together. And I think the technology we're building here is going to be essential to this. And so I'm exploring the space and building things that I'm really excited to tell you about later today.
Awesome. Okay, so we have Iain working on The Crypt, which is a game in the Lootverse. We have Rafa working on game design at Dapper Labs. We have Arb and GVN working on Moving Castles, which is this really cool kind of experimental game design, and working on Lattice as a part of DE.F.CON. So now that kind of everyone's familiar, I'll ask questions of specific people, but really feel free to take it and we can have more of a conversation. So my first question is to you guys, but also more broadly. I feel like one of the things that's very exciting about crypto native gaming is that it's this complete green field, right? Like we're kind of discovering the primitives and like what's actually possible here as we go. You know, with each step that we take, we can see the next step in front of that. And so I'm curious how all of you think about how you kind of experiment and how you unravel where all of this is going. And why I thought you might have an interesting take on this is you've just been experimenting with a whole bunch of interesting things over the last year. You've been running these Twitch streams where you like have a mascot and games that like the audience is playing through the chat, you know, the chat window. So I'm curious if you could tell the story of your arc of experimentation, and then whoever else wants to also add something to this pile.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, we're a small team, and we're kind of faced the challenge of building on-chain games. We're quite aware of our own, or I would say the general field. Like, this is a new space, as you said, and our objective was to try to get as many people testing our assumptions as soon as possible. So the thing we've done over the last months has been setting up these game experiments that test individual player representation, the kind of creation of collective avatars. We built a castle creator. Castles is what we call the kind of collective agents. And we're building games between these castles. And we're doing that using a simple system where we have an Unreal instance with a game, and then we broadcast that as a video to Twitch. And then people that connect their Twitch handles via a database where we do inventory can do inputs via the Twitch chat. And through that, we can very simply build games for 50 to 150 people where they control one entity together, and we play around with simple chat inputs translating into different governance schemes. We can switch between governance schemes, etc. And it's been a very, very successful way of testing kind of these things without too much kind of development cost or on each experiment. And yeah, it's been very fun as well. It's kind of nice treating these things as almost like spectator sports or something like that. There's a lot of people and there's a lot of energy when everyone is watching the same thing. And yeah, we've been looking a lot at like Twitch Plays Pokemon for this, which we think is a very interesting example of the kind of energy we're going for in terms of like collective avatars and the excitement that comes from everyone controlling one thing or kind of feeling like, yeah, this thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reading some of your blog posts earlier and kind of went down this rabbit hole of different people who've experimented with involving the crowd. And there was this one article you linked to where this guy had people trade 25K as a crowd, like Twitch Plays Pokemon for like trading. And he got kind of wrecked through that process. But I feel like there's a lot of interesting kind of involving the crowd and how something plays out to play around with.
Yeah, there's actually an interesting paper that talks about the use of, this is a very like specific paper, but it's a paper that specifically talks about the use of animals and non-human agents in Twitch streams as a way for groups to project their collective control on something, and how the absence of a human streamer allows a kind of group identity to emerge. And yeah, it's a very, very nerdy but very interesting to us field, the overlap of animal and Twitch streams.
Yeah. And Rafa, I'm curious if you, in terms of like experimenting with new ideas, do you have anything interesting to say about how at Dapper you think about when to like take a big bet on something, and like how you kind of go through the process of mapping out this larger space of possibilities?
Yeah, so honestly, I don't think there's the time to make any big bets, because the big bets means like a couple of years. And considering the speed that things change, that paradigms change, that new technology and new ideas come up, you got to be able to pivot and test and switch in a few months, right? So I think that right now it's all about like small experiments and trying to map out that more on the fringe area, right? Now, if you're talking about, bringing IP and all that, then of course you need a little bit more robust. But I think that this kind of experiment, right, where the basis is to have a collective play, is to have people playing in kind of a corp, but in a very open way, in a very transparent way through the blockchain. That's an innovation that we could not have before, not at this level of trust, not at this level of clarity for everyone involved. And this is the kind of, we don't know what those genres are gonna be, right? Like they are all established around classic games, around free-to-play, and we don't know what those are going to be in this space. So that's the time to find out.
And so how, practically speaking, does this show up in how you plan releases or like how you work at Dapper? Do you think in terms of like, I don't know, 3-month cycles? Like how does this show up in terms of how you build?
No, it's not. It's very short cycles. Like we think about releases and features like in terms of weeks usually, and then on larger, yeah, it's basically weeks at this point. And then sometimes we get we onboard a lot of people into Flow, because that's another thing, right? The technology also is evolving, right? You have roll-ups, right? And our roll-ups already know we're going to do something different, right? Oh, there's L2, you know, there are other EVM chains there, because we know that the technology is going to change, because it just doesn't scale enough when you're talking about, you know, even 100,000 users, which when you look at other games, right, it's very small still, but it just doesn't hold, and the price goes crazy. So we try to, so that's why we built our chain, and then we try to onboard projects into the chain, but then they are very much independent and try to let them do whatever they want. Or basically try to give them the lessons about, there are many lessons that we have already learned, right? Like inflation, emission of any kind of token through gameplay is something that you have to be extremely careful. If I'm going to put it in the most basic, generic way, is like sinks and faucets, right? Like they have to be so carefully designed. When you start to emit when you start to create some kind of token within your game, you have to be super careful. And also the possibility that you have that players are actually going to be scripts, because that will happen. I find that's amazing to have players that are actually full running scripts, but then they can exploit a lot this kind of issue, and then your whole economy has to be very tight. So yeah, those are the things that I'm most interested in.
Yeah. I remember actually Justin and I talked about this on the podcast episode we recorded, and you were talking about sinks and you know, sources of new materials coming in, and how a kind of game could have a built-in central bank of sorts that puts a floor and a ceiling on these, and it's like, I'll just buy all of the commodities. Like, there's just different ways that people have gone about solving these problems.
That is super dangerous. Like the Bank of England actually once broke like that, and many countries actually had issues with their, because this reasoning of quantitative, that's what I find fun. Like, I've always studied economy. Like, I see quantitative easing happening on games is really cool. But so one of, if you go back to games, right, and you think about it, say, oh, there's emission, there are sinks and all that. So in a way, conflict-based games are very helpful, because with conflict, there's always destruction, and destruction is a very effective sink. So if you make sure that there is enough destruction, there's enough also transformation, because if you have like different kinds of materials, and then that transformation gives loss from one step to the next, that's also another way to elegantly put sinks and, you know, shed off a little bit of the excessive construction. So yeah, it's just about being smart and being careful, because on chain, everything's forever. And if everything's forever and you can build things, then it's going to get crowded.
Right. So Iain, maybe bringing you in, one of the, I think there's just so many kind of interesting things playing out at the same time, and I feel like one of them is this idea of derivatives being built off of, you know, these different kind of ecosystems or NFTs or games, giving birth to derivative projects that kind of have their own economic engines. Like the builders of those like are just building like independent entities. And a lot of people have talked about CC0, Creative Commons 0, and how that can play a role in all of this. And I feel like you probably have a unique point of view as someone who's built an ambitious game on top of loot. So I'm curious, both as a builder, you know, in the loot ecosystem, what have been maybe some unintuitive or like surprising things you've experienced as a result of like building on loot, whether it's like in terms of engaging with that community or on the technological side? And two, I'm curious, like, how would you think about designing a project so that derivatives can kind of successfully spawn off of it?
Yes, good questions, and and I think a big part of what's exciting about crypto native gaming, or whatever we call it, is this concept of interoperability and building a shared set of game physics rather than single games. And I think loot has been is an ongoing sort of at the vanguard of that experiment of how that works. I think one of the pleasantly surprising things for me was how involved the community is in bringing the different derivative projects together. There's dozens of different projects, games, art representations, story writing, music, all based on this single loot NFT. And each one of them is kind of done in obviously wanting to advance their own thing, but in an altruistic way. There's kind of this win-win situation. If you're giving something to loot as a community, you're building up the value of loot and everyone else's project, and they're doing the same for you. So it's everyone is motivated, and I think it makes, in hindsight, that makes sense. Everyone's equally motivated to promote everyone else's project, so you get this sort of flywheel of community happening. From the technical side of it, there's so many different ways these derivatives and projects can go. I think that is perhaps more challenging, and it requires a bit more close. A lot of the time, it requires closer coordination. So an example is there's a project called the Rift, which builds XP for loot. So there's all these derivatives where loot bags can be used, so raiding the crypts or being used to mint art, hyperloot, which is a art representation of the loot bags, many other projects, and they're all but this Rift project is aiming to bring those together by each of them awarding XP in a central place. So it's another element of this bigger game ecosystem. And in some senses, that can be done permissionlessly by that project, just noticing where it's being used and awarding XP. But it becomes more interesting when those projects build in awarding of the XP and then more so using XP within their project. So if you've got a bag that's got enough XP to be level 10, you do something different with it in your game. And that requires a certain amount of technical and non-technical collaboration to happen. And I think that the lessons from loot is that there's motivation there to do that, and there's challenges there, but because the motivation, you can overcome them.
Super interesting. So to make sure I understand, this project Rift is basically this kind of shared reputation system for the lootverse. And for the time being, they're kind of canvassing the space and assigning some level of XP to each loot bag. But like maybe in the future, different projects can kind of like can do that on their own and then also be consumers of this XP metric.
Exactly. And so they've recently gone live with their representation of XP across all of the three major loot derivative NFTs. And so in terms of the crypt, chapters 1 and chapter 2 have been historically awarded XP for anyone who raided. Chapter 3, which is going live in a couple of days, people raiding will be directly awarded their XP. So we're getting more tighter integration. And then hopefully chapter 4, those that have leveled up will get some bonuses whilst playing the crypt, as well as bonuses and different use cases across the lootverse.
Yeah, that's super cool.
If I may, just going back to the experimental question that these guys are talking about, I think in game development in general, it's really important to experiment all the time, being able to pivot quickly, try things out with an audience, like what you guys are doing with building your off-chain version of a future on-chain game, so you can test it quickly. It's super important, and even more important when the technology is changing and the possibilities are evolving as we go. And so one thing we're trying to do at Playmint is we're releasing, it's been measured in weeks so far. We have chapters of the crypt, we're releasing that quickly so we can learn and try new ideas out quickly. But at the same time, we're trying to make a big bet as well. So it feels difficult to make the big bet kind of maybe sort of a year's worth of game development so you can get the scope to build a rich 3D animated world. So we're doing them in parallel. We've got our big bet with our experiments being released quickly, and they're kind of feeding into each other. So we're experimenting with the process as much as anything else. Yeah.
Totally. Do you have any thoughts on reputation or these XP points? And then I have a more substantial maybe direction after.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think that the one thing that is really tricky when you have something that is opaque to the machine, you have loot, which is a piece of string that is left to interpretation to a human, and that makes it very general because people can come and build different things with it. But the big blocker is that you essentially hit the problem of reconciliation when you have this, because you have this loot project and then people build XPs on top, and it's like culture, like nobody owns a meme. There is no canonical rule for what a meme should be, and so it develops essentially organically. The thing is, games strive on a shared state that is canonical. You don't go on World of Warcraft and you say, well, Blizzard tells me I'm here, but actually I'm there. Like, I believe in my position more than Blizzard. No, like, Blizzard is the god that decides the canonical version of everything. And games have been very intoxicating when there is a shared state that is enforced by someone. And so far, I think it has only ever worked when there's a first party that come and decide on those rules. And I think the thing that is really interesting with loot is that multiple people come together and through social consensus agree that, well, like 15 people might have started an XP thing, but actually the XP we believe in is this one. It's almost like religion. There are fake prophets and real prophets. And I think one thing that is really interesting is that the problem you're going to have if there is one person that can decide, or like even a community that can decide who to assign XP to for what action, is that now you're essentially always slowed down by the problem of reconciliation. What is worth XP? What is not worth XP? How do you get the community to agree what is XP? And this is even with like very simple primitives. If you scale it up, you basically have to stay at the level of culture. And if you want to go into like big games with shared state, you had like very real problems. And I think this is actually because it's two very different kind of experiences. And sometimes people come with primitives that are in culture, and they expect to build games that look like the big games we have right now with a single entity that decides what is real and what is not. And it's like trying to build Wolfenstein 3D as a board game. It just makes no sense. You are essentially dealing with different experiences. And I think one thing that is going to be really interesting is see how we can have a middle path between those two. Primitives that the crowd decide on and that are essentially handled through reconciliation and agreement. Worlds that are very rich where there is a single god that decides what is true and what is not, and like make sure that the rules are enforced. And I think there is a middle path, and that's the most exciting thing we're seeing right now with on-chain games. So yeah.
I think the interesting thing there is what, like you say, what is granted permission by the world to be the canonical form, the correct version, and that can naturally evolve in all these spaces, and where it fits in that line from fully decentralized to owned by a single game. What succeeds will be what gets played, and where the community goes, and it can naturally fall where it falls, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there's kind of there's a spectrum of on probably, on the one extreme you have a game that's completely defined by a central player. There's like the state, there's the narrative, like it's just like one thread that's moving forward, and it's very easy to make sense of. On the other, and then like as you move down the spectrum, there's probably somewhere on this spectrum where there is a shared, game state and maybe some canonical way of orienting towards that the game designer provides, and it lets players kind of like engage with it in different ways. Then I feel like loot in some ways is probably like at this extreme of it really just gives nothing. It just gives like the bags and not even a narrative arc, right? So then there's different narrative arcs that people can build and like cohere around. And I think the ultimate metric of it is like what do human players vibe with ultimately? What do people engage with?
Absolutely, and I think that what they engage with, and that will come from the success of the individual projects that are building within that universe, and and it's not necessarily building on the game physics and elements itself, but it's not marketing, but it's a presentation of that, like the coherent stories, the beautiful stories, the imagery that will capture people's imaginations, and but essentially living on this same underlying set of assets. Yeah.
Arb and GVN, I know this is, at least my understanding is that you have a take on this, right? Part of what you're talking about with moving castles is that we're going to move, we're going to move away from having a single narrative arc and allow these kind of like smaller, fragmented communities, which are self-cohesive in themselves, but are like independent in how they're moving forward. And this is like part of how you're thinking about things, I understand. Like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we deal a lot, or especially also it's probably my personal interest in like this collective like lore or imagery creation. And it's something that we experimented with in like
maybe speak up a bit too, if you can.
Sorry?
Maybe speak up a bit more.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's something that we have experimented with in like different type of like authored and like collectively built lore. So we did a bunch of experiments in which we started with like the Discord community, and we had this like sort of like we kind of like outlined the script of a world, or like the general rules and laws, and then we like left blanks and left the community engage with the text and see where they would bring it, and like drop references. We had like like Figma session where people could drop images, and they could like kind of like build this like outline of like, or like kind of like world building together, and then we kind of like interpret it, ask like several artists to like interpret this input, and then we ask like other artists to kind of work on like the 3D model. So we kind of build this like step by step, still trying to keep the kind of like the world, the production of the world like at a certain like standard, but like always switching between like different way of producing content. Yeah,
I think what we're trying to do is give as much freedom on the individual community to define their lore and kind of build their castle, but at the same time there is a need for a kind of, I don't know if we call it digital physics or what we call it, but there needs to be a rule set that exists for the interactions between them, so that that there is a game to play between them, basically. Because otherwise we have these floating units that then each time need to negotiate on what terms they interact from scratch, and there is like not a, there's why. So it's very interesting, and it's exactly this tension between constrained physics to a cultural kind of self-definition and constant reinterpretation. And we're finding out where to place which of those within what we're developing.
These ideas around composability, I think they're extremely, extremely exciting, and they hit really against the grain on classic game development, right? Because the reflex of any game developer from those are like, oh, we're going to do an XP system. Oh, I'm going to do a better one, and I'm going to rewrite it from scratch and all that. Now what happens is that, so in Lud, like there's someone made an XP system, and it's being recognized by the community, and everybody's using it. So why would I not build on top of it? Why would I not create like a fighting system? So it's very modular. It's almost like a feature that goes on top of it. And as the time progresses, now I have all these other systems, all these other properties that have been made by the community that I can lean on, that I can extract and just add like, a little brick. And then the game becomes this big tapestry, right? Where different developers did little bricks, and some tried, some died out, others are accepted by the community, And the way the games play, the systems that become the most are the ones that, community decides, that are the most popular. And sometimes there are going to be some satellite ones that are very niche, but people still love them. Like, oh my God, they use that weird XP system, and well, whatever, right? It's always those 100 people that always do that. And then there's the big one that, the main thing. And it's not new when you come to think about it, right? If you squeeze it a little bit, like, some of the most popular games today are derivative games. They are mods, right? Any MOBA is a mod, like any MOBA. LoL is a mod, like it started as a mod. Dota, Counter-Strike is a mod. So, and the power with the blockchain is that you get the mod, and automatically you get the audience from the previous one, because you're building on top of an existing audience. So you have this huge possibility of, easier success.
Yeah. Were you gonna?
I just wanted to add an interesting thing about what the community adopts is the one that succeeds. It's not necessarily the one which is the best code. So you have smart contracts written with bugs in them, or suboptimal that exist forever because the community play with them, and that's an interesting development mindset to have. Yeah.
I had a follow-up question because there's not often someone that worked on EVE on the same panel. Are there any learnings from EVE open APIs that can? It feels like it's something we look at, the way that like EVE kind of expanded out onto the internet by the use of an API that can be used as an identity standard, and it feels like such a interesting example for people building crypto games that I would love to hear if there are any learnings from that can be had, for the people in the room.
Humor. Yes, there are many learnings. I'm gonna talk to the one like there are issues. There's like kill lists that you have to get your name there, and players like are really excited about it, but then they can fake stuff. Those can be complicated. But like a very simple one is just the market, right? The market and the map. So EVE in the client, you can see the current disposition of the map of sovereignty. That means like ownership of certain parts of the galaxy. And then you can also go and check the market prices, because each station has its own market with its own prices, because, everything's created by the players. So if I want to buy a ship here or a ship, 5 jumps away, the price is not the same. So from the open APIs, and there's a limitation of visibility within the client, but with the open APIs, what the players did is that they have this perfect information sites, and they have multiple. Sometimes they're like 2 or 3 market, crawlers that show the prices of everything. So you can easily find optimum routes, do arbitrage around markets and all that. That comes naturally from the play. This is extreme, EVE did that, and it's like, oh, this is so cool. Like, players are creating their own tools, and they're making this for blockchain. Like, it's table stakes. That's why blockchain is so exciting, right? You have like very few games that actually allow this thing, and blockchain has it as a basic on the technology. So, Dota also has very interesting open API dynamics. When you can see every time they change a meta, people like go over the open APIs to see which hero is actually the most powerful. So they see like the curves of wins and all that. So I think that this logic of, from a read standpoint, open APIs are great because they give visibility and all that can challenge your gameplay if you have hidden gameplay, so you have to be smart about that. From a read-write standpoint, that gets way more complicated. So, because now what you're talking about is that you're talking directly to the rule set in the code, and then you're bypassing the client. That, personally, I think is one of the most artistic forms of game development on the blockchain, because now you're playing a clientless game. It's like playing chess with the numbers, like just the moves. And then the client that interfaces with that can be anything. Can be a 3D representation, can be a 2D representation, can even be a physical representation with the pieces that then sends up and talks to the rule set. But that is, I think that is still a few months away at least.
I'd like to add on this.
Yeah.
So what Rafael was just talking about is really interesting. I think it's client agnosticity, right? You have a protocol, you can visualize in whatever way you want. And I think the most exciting thing about this, not only does it allow other people who might be better at you to build a better client, it actually allows for different scales. So if you want virtual worlds to grow, there will be many different ways to interact with them. And so you can almost expect someone who has a lot of like quote unquote power in this world to interact with it through something like Twitter. Like you don't actually deal with like the day-to-day things that peasants deal with. You just you just vote on stuff and you talk with people. Similarly, if you just want to be in this world to look around, you would probably use a different client. And this is very reminiscent to email, where you can use different email clients, and they all have their own strength. I also think this is like a huge area for monetization. You can build a protocol that is open, but you can build a premium client on top that you sell access to. It's like your Gmail to your email. And I think that's very interesting. Also, to go back to what you were saying about open state, it is true that you get read API for free, but that can actually be a problem. You know, you need private state at some point. And this is why games like Dark Forest that spend a bunch of time on, okay, how do you actually build decentralized execution of a game while maintaining private state is really interesting. And this is very, very new. And I think most projects today will just completely ignore the private state part of this. Yeah.
I'm curious, maybe following up on this question of players of various kinds writing directly to the game, database, basically. So I imagine that different archetypes of users will emerge, right? There's someone who's just like playing the game for enjoyment and is using the default UI, and then there's someone who's written a Rust client and is like purely crunching numbers and trying to like maximize their financial gain, especially if there are NFTs and ERC20s and all of these things embedded in these games. So how do you design a game that is actually, enjoyable for an end user, or is that even what you optimize for? And I can also, just kind of thinking out loud here, I definitely see the parallels to applications on Ethereum, right? You can trade on Uniswap as an individual user on the UI, but on the other side, there's like bots with hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're getting front run and all of these things, and somehow the two coexist together. But I'm curious if anyone here, maybe you first.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that this is the answer, but there is a good hint on how you can think about it. Is I think it's Bartol's studies around MMOs, where he defines.
Sorry, what was that?
Bartol, B-A-R-T-L-E.
Okay.
Archetypes around MMO players, where you have like the achiever, the killer, the explorer, and then you see that people enter the game with very different motivations. And like one has fun when I destroy the other, so it's very PvP oriented. The other one has fun when he's exploring and discovering the world. The other has fun when they are improving themselves, so basically PvE, high level play. And I'm not saying that this is the answer, but that's a nice way, that's a nice heuristic to start to think about it. So, okay, there are going to be the min-maxers, optimizers, and they are going to be, squeezing to be super. Okay, fine. Who are they serving? Is there someone that they can serve that's going to be playing another type of game or playing, but they share a universe, right? It's a lot of, work division kind of logic because, each person has their head, like, gets their thing, and, so there's beer, there's wine, there's weed, there's whatever, right? So each one does their thing, but they're all in the same party. Sorry for the metaphor, that's not nice.
One sentence here. I think we can learn a lot from our society, where we have mega corporation existing along with someone like me, and I just walk around and I take the metro and I buy little things, and they buy big things and they don't take the metro, and we all coexist together. And I think there's a lot to learn from like this world as well.
Yeah. And I like what you say, Rafa, about like these different archetypes of players could fulfill different roles in this ecosystem, right? Like for a DEX, like there's a market maker who's providing liquidity and they're just operating at a completely different scale, but they're actually necessary for like the end users having a good experience. So that makes sense to me. So gradually coming to the end, Justin, maybe you can take this last question, and then curious for anyone else on the topic of interoperability. And we were talking earlier about, like let's say the loot XP kind of system that emerges and a bunch of games integrate with that. I'm curious, as someone who's been working, inside of 0x Park between Dark Forest, Ember, Lattice, which is this like engine that helps make this sort of thing happen. How do you see these games interoperating, and are you seeing kind of interesting first glimpses of that out in the wild?
Yeah, this is basically what my keynote is going to be about. But I think right now the narrative of worlds interacting together has been overplayed, and it just doesn't work that well. For something like loot, it works because it's like tiny primitives. But if you have really big worlds, then it's almost impossible for them to agree on. There's just so much reconciliation to do between all of them, right? What is a Ferrari in World of Warcraft? Well, nobody has any clue. It's not even the right question to ask in the first place. So I think I don't want to spoil too much for this afternoon, but I think we're going to move towards more restrictive paradigm of computation that are more suited to those problems. I think it's the general problem of societal computing. How do you agree together on things? And one way is to do it just through reconciliation and governance and just having to vote on everything. I think there are other ways, and that's, I think, where this stuff is going to go towards.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask one last question too. In terms of like how we're designing these games for end users, I'm curious how any of you think about this. There's this one point of view, which is there are a ton of new people coming into crypto, right? And expecting someone to go and use, MetaMask and click through to Etherscan and understand what the hell is going on, that's just like never going to happen. And so we should abstract away basically the blockchain, right? You shouldn't even know that you're playing a blockchain game. And then on the other side, I hear the point of view that you actually want to kind of emphasize, like show a little bit of under the engine so people get a sense of what's happening. And I know, for example, Dark Forest had a pretty opinionated take on this with like showing the ZKPs on the side. Because like you could just be playing this space game and it's not so interesting, but if it's ZKPs on a smart contract, then all of a sudden you realize a whole new thing is happening. So curious if you have thoughts.
I have a strong opinion on that one, even though it's weakly held, but I have a strong opinion. Is that, so I'm old, so I used computers before there was an internet. So, and I used computers that would talk to each other through modems and BBSs before there was an internet. It was hell. Like you had to configure ANSI, like ANSI and ASIC art, and it was really annoying to do. But you still had the magic of communicating with another computer that was miles away, and it like was mind-blowing at the time. Still is to a certain extent. But the thing is that I believe that you have not to hide, but to simplify the access to the benefits of the technology. So right now, I can do the kind of thing that before I had to use Blue Wave, I had to start up an IRC server, connect on a dial modem, all that shit. I do that from my phone by doing one click. I have the same benefit. Does it mean that you have to go under the hood and understand what's TCP/IP and all that? No, I don't. But I get the benefit. I think that the logic for blockchain has to be kind of similar. It's not about, you got to create your MetaMask, you got to suffer. No, you don't have to. I think it has to be an easier onboarding. I think it's really important. But they have to understand that this only happens because of blockchain. The same way I know that my phone, I only can WhatsApp because of the internet, right? So it's a little bit subtle, so it's neither one side nor the other, but I think that's the real democratization of the technology. And it comes inevitably, right? Every single technology went through this, and we're going to get there. Yeah.
I agree that it will get there. It's kind of inevitable. The friction will go as it becomes mass market. I think what we're thinking at the moment is it's not there yet, and it'll come, but it's not our focus to remove that friction. Our focus is to serve the existing knowledgeable market of crypto-savvy, at least crypto-curious players. So it's okay at the moment, the level of friction that's there. It will go, though. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we probably have a bit of Stockholm syndrome, like having been using the existing infrastructure. And also thinking back to the internet, like hearing the sound of the modem was kind of weirdly pleasant, right? So maybe we can keep some of that. Well, we're at time. Thank you so much, Iain, Rafa, Arv, GVN, and thank you all for listening.